Good evening, everyone. Come on in. Good to see you. Find yourself a place. Here we go again, right? Big fire and lots of people, and this is fun. And tonight, I want to talk to you about Max Brand's book, The Seventh Man. This is book 3 of the Untamed, of course, but it seems from reading this story that it's just dragging us out. You know there's going to be another big battle here sometime soon, but gosh, we just keep working our way to it. And maybe that's what's going to happen here with chapter 25. Let's find out. The title of the chapter is The Battle. We'll see. And so here we go. Maybe Daddy Dan sent Bart back alone, Miner. Well, does he do that often? Come quickly, Joan, run. She ran towards the entrance, stumbling over the uneven ground and dragging Joan behind her. But when they came close, the wolf dog bristled and sent down the cavern a low growl that stopped him like an invisible barrier. The softest sounds in his register were ominous warnings to those that did not know Black Bart. But Kate and Joan understood that this muttering, this harsh thunder, was an ultimatum. If she had worn her revolver, a light, beautifully mounted .32, which Dan had given her, Kate would have shot that wolf and gone on across his body. For she had learned from Whistlin Dan to shoot quickly as one points a finger and straight by instinct. Even as she stood there barehanded, she looked about her desperately for a weapon. Upon seeing the daylight and the promise of escape beyond, and only this dumb beast between her and freedom. Once before, many a year before, she had gone like this, with empty hands, and subdued Black Bart simply through the power of quiet courage and the human eye. She was determined to try that same thing again. Stand there quietly, Joan. Don't move until I tell you. She made a firm step towards Bart. Munner, he'll bite. Hush, Joan, don't speak. At her forward movement, that wolf dog flattened his belly to the rock, and she saw his forepaws, large, almost the hands of a man, dig and work for a purchase from which he could throw himself at her throat. Steady, Bart. His silence was more terrible than a snarl, yet she stretched out her hand and made another step. It brought a sharp tensing to the body of Bart. The fur stood up about his throat like the mane of a lion, and his eyes were a devilish green. Another instant she kept her place. Then she remembered the story of Haynes, how Bart had gone with his master to that killing at Alder. If he had killed once, he would kill again. Wild as he had been on that other time when she quelled him, he had never before been like this. The courage melted out of her. She forgot the pleasant day outside. She only saw those blazing eyes and shrank back towards the center of the cave. The muscles of the wolf dog relaxed visibly. And not till that moment did she realize how close she had been to the crisis. Bad Bart, cried Joan, running in between. Bad dog. Stop, Joan, don't go near him. But Joan was already almost to Bart. When Kate would have run to snatch the child away, that deep, rattling growl stopped her again. And now she saw that Joan ran not the slightest danger. She stood beside that huge beast with her tiny fist raised. I'll tell Daddy Dan for you, she shrilled. Black Bart made a furtive, cringing movement towards the child, but instantly stiffened again and sent his warning down the cave to Kate. Then a shadow fell across the entrance as Dan stood there, with Satan walking behind. His glance ran from the bristling body of Bart to Kate, shrinking among the shadows, and lingered without a spark of recognition. Satan, he ordered, go on into your place. The black stallion glided past the master and came on until he saw Kate. He stopped, snorting, and then circled her with his head suspiciously high and ears back, until he reached the place where his saddle was usually hung, and there he waited. And Kate felt the eyes of the horse, the wolf, the man, and even Joan curiously upon her. Evening, nodded Dan. Might you have come up for supper? And that was all. Not a step towards her, not a smile, not a greeting, and Between them stood Joan, her hands clasped idly before her while she looked from face to face, trying to understand. All the pangs of heart which come to woman between girlhood and old age went burningly through Kate in that breathing space, and afterwards she was cold and saw herself and all the others clearly. I haven't come from supper. I've come to bring you back, Dan. Not that she had the slightest hope that he would answer, but she watched him curiously, almost as if he were a stranger, just to see how he would answer. Come back? He echoed. To the cabin? Where else? It ain't happy there, he started. You've come up here with us, Kate, and raised Joan like a young animal in a cave? He looked at her with wonder and then at the child. Ain't you happy, Joan, up here? Oh, Daddy Dan, Joan's so happy. You see? He said to Kate. She's terribly happy. It was his utter simplicity which convinced her that arguments and pleas would be perfectly useless. And just behind that cool command which she kept over herself now was hysteria. She knew that if she relaxed her purposefulness just for an instant, the love for him would rush over her and weaken her. She kept her mind clear and steady with a great effort, which was like divorcing herself from herself. When she spoke, there was another being which stood aside, listening in wonder to the words. You've chosen this life, Dan. I won't blame you for leaving me this time any more than I blamed you the other times. I suppose it isn't you. It's just the same impulse after all that took you south after the wild geese. She stopped, almost broken down by the memory, and then recalled herself sternly. It's the same thing that led you away after Max Strand through the storm. But whether it's a weakness in you or the force of something outside your control, I see this thing clearly. We can't go on. This is the end. He seemed troubled, vaguely, as a dog is anxious when it sees a child weep and cannot make out the reason. Oh, Dan, she burst out, I love you more than ever. And if I were alone, I'd follow you to the end of the world and live as you live and do as you do. But it's Joan. She has to be raised as a child should be raised. She ain't going to live with wild horses and wolves all her life. And if she stays on here, don't you see that the same thing, which is the curse in you, will grow strong and it'll be a curse in her? Don't you see it growing? It's in her eyes. Her step is too light. She's lost her fear of the dark. She's drifting back into wildness, Dan, and she has to go with me back to the cabin. At that, she saw him start again and put his hand out with a swift, subtle gesture towards Joan. Let me have her. I have to have her. She's mine. Then, more gently, you can come to see her whenever you will. And finally, pray God, you will come and stay with us, always. He had stepped to Joan while she spoke, and his hands made a quick movement of cherishing about her golden head, without touching it. For the first and last time in her life, she saw something akin to fear in his eyes. Kate, I can't come back. I got things to do out here. Then let me take her. She watched the wavering in him. Things would be kind of empty if she was gone, Kate. Why? She asked bitterly. You say you have your work to do out here. He considered this gravely. I don't know, except that I sort of need her. She knew from of old that such questions only puzzled him, and soon he would cast away the attempt to decide and act. Action, that was his sphere. There was only one matter in which he was unfailingly, relentlessly the same, and that was justice. To that sense in him, she would make her last appeal. Dan, I can't take her. I only ask you to see that I'm right. She belongs to me. I bought her with pain. It was a staggering blow to Whistlin Dan. He took off his sombrero and passed his hand slowly across his forehead, then looked at her with a dumb appeal. I only want you to do the thing that you think is square, Dan. Once more he winced. Then, slowly, I'm trying to be square. I'm trying hard. I know you got a claim in her, but it seems like I have too. She's like a part of me, mostly. When she's happy, I feel like smiling, sorta. And when she cries, it hurts me so and I can't hardly stand it. He paused, looking wistfully from the staring child to Kate. He said, with sudden illumination, "Let her do the judging. You ask her to go to you, I'll ask her to come to me. Ain't that square?" For a moment, Kate hesitated. But as she looked at Joan, it seemed to her that when she stretched out her arms to her baby, nothing in the world would keep them apart. "It's fair," she answered. Dan dropped to one knee. "Joan, you got to make up your mind. If you want to stay with Satan, speak up. Satan." The stallion whinnied softly, and Joan smiled. "With Satan and Black Bart." The wolf dog had glided near and now stood watching. "And with Daddy Dan, well, you just come to me. But if you want to go to Munner, you just go." On his face the struggle showed, the struggle to be perfectly just. "If you stay here, maybe it'll be cold, and sometimes when the wind blows, and maybe it'll be hard other ways, and if you go to Munner's, she'll always be taking care of you, and no harm will ever come to you, and you'll sleep soft between sheets. And if you wake up in the night, she'll be there to talk to you. And you'll have pretty little dresses, all kinds of colors on 'em, most like. Joan, do you want to go to Munner, or stay here with me?" Perhaps the speech was rather long to Joan to follow, but the conclusion was plain enough. And there was Kate. She also, upon one knee and with her arms stretched out. "Joan, my baby, my darling." "Munner," whispered the child and ran towards her. A growl came up in the throat of Black Bart and then sank away into a whine. Joan stopped short and turned her head. "Joan!" cried Kate. Anguish made her voice loud. From the loudness, Joan shrank, for there was never a harsh sound in the cave except the growl of Bart warning away danger. She turned quite around, and there stood Daddy Dan, perfectly erect, quite indifferent, to all seeming as to her choice. She went to him with a rush and caught at his hands. "Oh, Daddy Dan, I don't want to go. Don't you want Joan?" He laid a hand upon her head, and she felt the tremor of his fingers. The wolf dog lay down at her feet and looked up in her face. Satan from the shadows beyond whinnied again. After that, there was not a word spoken. For Kate looked at the picture of the three, saw the pity in the eyes of Whistlin Dan, saw the wonder in the eyes of Joan, and saw the truth of all she had lost. She turned towards the entrance and she went out, her head bowed, stumbling over the pebbles. Chapter 26, The Test. The most that could be said of Rickett was that it had a courthouse and plenty of quiet. So perfect that the minds of the office holders could turn and hear no sound save in their own turning. There were, of course, more buildings than the courthouse, but not so many that they could not be grouped conveniently along one street. The hush which rested over Rickett was never broken, except in the periods immediately after the spring and the fall roundups, when the saloons and the gaming tables were suddenly flooded with business. Otherwise, it was a rare event indeed which injected excitement into the village. Such an event was the gathering of Sheriff Pete Glass's posse. There had been other occasions when Pete and the officers before his time had combed the county to get the cream of the fighting men, but the gathering of the new posse became different in many ways. In the first place, the call for members was not confined to the county, for though it stretched as large as many a minor European kingdom, it had not the population of a respectable manufacturing town, and Pete Glass went far beyond its bounds to get his trailers. Everywhere he had the posters set up, and on the posters appeared debate. The state began the game with a reward of $3,000. The county plastered $2,000 on top of that to make it an even $5,000. Then the town of Alder dug into its deep pockets and produced $2,500, while disinterested parties added contributions, which swelled the total to around $10,000. $10,000 reward for the man described below, dead or alive. $10,000 which might be earned by the investment of a single bullet and the pressure on trigger. And above this, the fame which such a deed would bring. No wonder that the mountain desert hummed through all its peak and plains and stirred to life. Moreover, the news had gone abroad, and the tale of the killing of Alder and everything that went before, it went west. It appeared in newspapers. It cropped up at firesides. It gave a spark of terror to a myriad conversations, and everyone in Rickett felt that the eye of the nation was upon it. Everyone in Rickett dreamed nightly of the man described, Daniel Barry, called Whistlin Dan, about 5'9" or 10", slender, black hair, brown eyes, age about 30 years. Secretly, Rickett felt perfectly convinced that Sheriff Pete Glass alone could handle this feller, trim his claws, for they knew how many a bad man had built a reputation high as Babel and baffled posses and murdered right and left, until that little dusty man on that little dusty roan went out alone, came back alone, and another fierce name went from history into legend. However, there were doubters, since this affair had new earmarks. It had been buzzed abroad that Whistlin Dan was not only the hunted, but also the hunter, and that he had pledged himself to strike down all the 7 who first took his trail. 5 of these were already gone. 2 remained, and one of these 2 was Vic Gregg, no despicable fighter himself, and the other was no less than the invincible little sheriff himself. To imagine the sheriff beaten in the speed of his draw or the accuracy of his shot was to imagine the first cause, infinity, or whatever else is inconceivable. Nevertheless, there were such possibilities as bullets fired at night through the window and attacks from the rear. So Rickett waited, held its breath, and kept its eyes rather more behind than in front. In the meantime, there was no lack of amusement, for from the 4 corners blown by the 4 winds, men rode out of the mountain desert and drifted into Rickett to seek for a place on that posse. 20 men, that was the goal the sheriff had set. 20 men trained to a hair. Beside the courthouse was a shooting gallery, not overmuch used except during the 2 animal seasons of prosperity and reckless spending. And Pete Glass secured this place to test out applicants. After they passed this trial, they were mustered into his presence, and he gave them an examination for himself. Just what he asked them, or what he would never be known. But some men came from his presence very red, and others extremely pale. And some men blustered, and some men swore, some men rode hastily out of town, spoke not a word. But few, very few, were those who came out wearing a little badge on their vest with the pride of a Knight of the Garter. At first the hordes rode in, young and old, youths keen for a taste of adventure, rusty fellers who had once been noted warriors, but those early levies soon discovered that courage and willingness was not so much valued as accuracy. And the old-timers learned also that accuracy must be accompanied by speed. And even when a man possesses both of these qualities of hand and eye, the gentle, inscrutable little man in the office might still reject them for reasons they just couldn't guess. This one thing was for certain. The next time Pete Glass ran for office, he would be beaten, even by a greaser. He made enemies at the rate of 100 a day during that period of selection. Still, the 20 was not recruited to the full. 13, 14, 15 were gathered into the fold, but still 5 men were lacking to complete the toll. Most men would have started their manhunt with that formidable force, but Pete Glass was methodical. In his own heart of hearts, he would have given his hope of heaven to meet Barry face to face and hand to hand, and see which was the better man. But Pete Glass owed a duty to his state before he owed a duty to himself. He stuck by his first plan, and every day the inhabitants of Rickett gathered at the shooting gallery to watch the tests and wonder at the successes and smile at the failures. It was a very hard test which the sheriff had imposed. A man stood to one side of the iron plate back wall which served as the target. He stood entirely out of sight, and through an aperture in the side wall, at a signal, he tossed a round ball of clay painted white. The marksman stood a good 10 paces off, and he must strike that clay ball as it passed across the target. The balls were so small that even to strike them when they were stationary was a difficult task, and to hit them in motion was enough to task the quickest eye and the cunningest hand. It was the old Pop Giersberg who stood with his ancient .45 behind the counter, with his feet braced on this bright morning, and behind him half a Rickett was gathered. "Did you give me warning, son?" he inquired of the man at the counter. "Nary a warning," grinned the other, who was one of the chosen 15. He wished Pop well, so did they all, but they had seen every man fail for 2 days at that target, and one and all they had their doubts. Pop had been a formidable man in his day, but now his hand was stiff and his hair was gray. He had at least 20 years older than he felt. He had hardly finished asking his question when a white ball was tossed across the target. Up came the gun of Pop Giersberg, exploded, and the bullet clanged on the iron. The white ball floated idly on across the wall and disappeared on the other side. "Give me another chance," pleaded Pop with a quaver in his voice. "That was just a try to get my eye in shape." "Sure," chuckled the deputy. "Everybody gets 3 tries. It ain't hardly natural to hit that ball the first crack. Leastways, nobody ain't done it yet. You just keep your eye peeled, Pop. That ball'll come out again." And Pop literally kept his eye peeled. He had double reason to pray for success, for his old woman had smiled and shook her head when he allowed that he would try out for a place on that posse. All his nerves grew taut and keen. He waited. And once more that white streak appeared, and surely he who threw that ball for every wish to see Pop succeed, for he tossed it high and easily. Again the gun barked from Giersberg's hand, and again the ball dropped almost slowly out of sight. "It's a trick," says Pop. "It's something damned queer. They're a considerable pile of gents. They think the same you do," admitted the deputy sheriff dryly. Pop glared at him and gritted his teeth. "Led the damn thing on again," he said, and muttered the rest of his sentence to himself. He jerked his hat lower over his eyes, spread his feet just a little more, and got ready for the last desperate chance. But fate was against Pop. 20 years before, he might have struck that mark if he had been in top condition, but today, though he put his very soul into the effort, and though that ball for the 3rd time was lobbed with utmost gentleness through the air, his bullet banged vainly against the sheet iron, and the white, inoffensive ball continued on his way. Words came into the throat of Pop, reached his open mouth, and died right there. He thrust the gun back into his holster and turned slowly towards the crowd. There was no smile to meet his challenging eye, for Pop was a known man, and though he might have failed to strike that elusive mark, there was no sign that he would fail to hit something 6 feet in height by a couple in breadth. When he found that no mockery awaited him, a sheepish smile began at his eyes and wandered dimly to his lips. "Well, gents," he muttered, "I guess I ain't as young as I once was. So long." He shouldered his way to the door and was gone. "That's about all, folks," said the deputy crisply. "I guess there ain't no more clamoring for a place today." He swept into the crowd with a competent eye. "If you got no objection," murmured a newcomer who had just slipped into the room, "I'd sort of like to take a shot at that." And with that, we're going to have to wait till next time we get around this campfire. Sounds like that Sheriff Glass is putting together a heck of a posse. Old Dan might just be in trouble this time. Be interesting, though. We'll talk about it next time I see you here at the campfire. Bring something nice to drink, folks. Bring a jacket next time. You can see it's getting cooler. And I look forward to seeing y'all again, folks, right here around the campfire with Clay Steele. Good night.